It's Fabulous Friday, September 25th, 2020. My name is Pam, and welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor. Let's get started. After the pandemic, where will the U.S. child care system end up? By Chelsea Sheasley. Mulawork Kania closed Amen Family Childcare for almost 2 months during the height of COVID-19 lockdowns. The business she operates out of her home in Washington, D.C., survived through a loan from the federal Paycheck Protection Program. Although she doesn't expect to close for good, she's worried about her costs. She employs 2 other people to help operate a 24-hour facility so she can care for children at night for parents working non-traditional hours. Prior to the pandemic, she purchased protective gloves for $42. Now they're running $89 a box. A box of disinfectant spray has jumped from $20 to $90. The federal government has to think about us, she said. We are super necessary. Without us, there is no work. We don't want to close our business. Ms. Kania faces challenges similar to those that have forced thousands of child care providers out of business over the past 6 months, as class sizes have dwindled due to pandemic restrictions and parents have opted to keep their children at home. When the public health crisis recedes, the United States may emerge with a loss of nearly half of its available child care spots, according to one study. Traditionally, closed child care businesses have not been quickly replaced. Yet the pandemic has also forced public attention on the role that childcare plays for families and the economy in a new way, advocates say, and has created momentum for a significant reevaluation of the U.S. care system, which has long been unaffordable for many parents and expensive for providers to operate. There is a need to build childcare back better, says Marcia Cox Mitchell, Director of Early Learning at the Baniam Family Foundation in Bethesda, Maryland, which helps establish a new private fund that provides grants to child care operators in Washington, D.C., including Ms. Kania. It's now a conversation that's happening outside of the insular child care space. While there's widespread agreement on the crisis facing the U.S. child care industry, solutions vary, from creating a universal child care system to focusing on reducing regulations and fostering more parent choice, experts say. Whether the political appetite exists at the state or federal levels to create long-term change is open for debate. I think the question is, are we going to make incremental improvements or are we going to have wholesale change, says Elliot Haspel, author of Crawling Behind America's Child Care Crisis and How to Fix It. He says child care has not been a top political issue in the past, but that the pandemic has exposed how a lack of such care hurts the economy and child development. It's taking a toll. A June survey of 5,000 child care providers across the U.S. and Puerto Rico found that 40% of child care businesses say they are certain they will close permanently without further public assistance, and that on average, enrollment is down 67%. The number of child care providers who expect to close rose to 50% among minority-owned child care businesses, according to the survey from the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Congress allocated $3.5 billion for the child care industry in the CARES Act. Since then, the National Women's Law Center released a report estimating that the U.S. child care system needs at least $9.6 billion each month to survive the pandemic. In Richland, Virginia, J. David Young, the CEO of a nonprofit that runs 2 child care centers, is having to spend extra on cleaning products and reconfiguring building space. Enrollment in his centers, which serve mostly low-income families, has dropped in half. He knows other child care providers who are permanently closed due to spikes in expenses coupled with revenue drops. It is taking a toll, says Mr. Young, of the pandemic's impact on the finances of the nonprofit he leads, Friends Association for Children. He's confident that the organization will survive, but he said, it's not easy and it's not guaranteed. For communities of color in particular, this is a crisis built on top of a crisis, says Myra Jones Taylor, Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3. an advocacy group for young children. She points to examples of pre-COVID child care deserts, predominantly in low-income and rural areas where little affordable or quality child care exists. In addition, women of color constitute about 40% of the child care workforce. The families who already are in crisis mode and have been for so long are disproportionately in rural Black and brown communities, she says, and she worries the pandemic will exacerbate that trend. The U.S. is far behind. For families with young children, child care often serves as more than simply a place to leave kids while parents work. It also supports child development and early education for infants through pre-kindergartners who learn initial social and academic skills. Most developed countries put significantly more public resources towards child care than the U.S., says Samuel Measles, the founding executive director of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute at the University of Nebraska, who notes that education is particularly important during the earliest years between 0 and 5 years of age. France, Germany, almost every single westernized industrialized country has care for children and for families that this country does not have, whether it's the École Maternelle public preschool in France or the payments that cover salary for new parents in Scandinavia, he says. We are far behind those other countries. Part of the problem with the U.S. investing less in child care and preschool, observers say, is that it results in both high costs for parents, a national average of nearly $10,000, and extremely low wages for child care workers, since tuition doesn't cover the full cost of providing care, such as maintaining low staff-to-child ratios. We make child care operate much more like a restaurant than a public school or library, says Mr. Haspel. You have to have a certain number of paying customers to keep your doors open, as opposed to a public school or library where there's a constant stream of public funding coming in. It's a public good, and so they're not facing the same existential crisis if suddenly there aren't those paying customers. Seeking bipartisan common ground. The ideal of federal universal child care remains a political non-starter to most conservatives, said Hadley Health Manning, director of policy at Independent Women's Forum, a right-leaning think tank based in Washington, D.C., because of concerns over cost, lack of quality, and government overreach. I think it's tempting to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's a red flag with a lot of universal child care policies, she says. Instead, there might be more bipartisan willingness to address child care at state and local levels, she suggests, and to consider proposals such as increasing tax credit for families and reforming the dependent care flexible spending account so parents can set aside more tax-free dollars to spend on child care. The way to create a structure where families have access to affordable and high-quality child care and providers earn a decent living, says Dr. Jones Taylor of 0 to 3, is to transform public perception of child care from an individual family responsibility to a public good that benefits society and requires significant public investment. If we want the economy to get back going, we have to support this critical part, she says. The only way to do that is rethink this entire child care system and imagine it as the public good that it really is, she said. When you think about the way we invest in K through 12 education, we should be thinking of children under kindergarten in the very same way. One area of agreement for many policymakers is on the importance of home-based daycares during the pandemic and in the future, due to their small sizes and the role that the mostly female small business owner can play in their communities. Some employers and technology startups are trying to help with that. Jessica Chang, co-founder of WeCare in 2017, after she struggled to arrange childcare during her first pregnancy. The goal, she says, is to empower female entrepreneurs. The platform allows small home daycares to better advertise online and efficiently run their business. Mr. Young, who runs the Richland Child Care Centers, is hopeful that the pandemic will encourage people to view childcare as an educational service that deserves respect and support from the public and private sectors alike. I think this whole pandemic really serves to open folks' eyes, not just politicians, but everyone's eyes, he says. People realize now just how important the job is that we do. Well, this next article is titled Belarus President Takes Oath of Office in a Surprise Ceremony by Yuris Karmanow. Belarus President Lukashenko was sworn in during an unannounced ceremony after weeks of mass protests. Critics say the secrecy of the event was telling, and his election has been denounced by regional and opposition leaders as illegitimate. In Kyiv, Ukraine, President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus assumed his sixth term of office Wednesday during an inauguration ceremony that officials did not announce in advance after weeks of mass protests against the authoritarian leader's re-election, which opposition activists maintain was rigged. State news agency Belta reported that the swearing-in ceremony took place in the capital of Minsk, with several hundred top government officials, lawmakers, representatives of media organizations, and other prominent figures present. Mr. Lukashenko took an oath in Belarusian with his right hand on the country's constitution, and the head of the country's Central Election Commission handed him the official ID card of the President of Belarus. The day of assuming the post of the president is the day of our victory, convincing and fateful, Mr. Lukashenko said at the ceremony. We were not just electing the president of the country. We were defending our values, our peaceful life, sovereignty, and independence. Mr. Lukashenko has run Belarus, an ex-Soviet nation of 9.5 million, with an iron fist for 26 years. Officials' result of the country's August 9th presidential election had him winning 80% of the vote. His strongest opponent, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, got 10%. Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, who is in exile after being forced to leave Belarus, has not accepted the outcome of the election as valid. Neither have the thousands of her supporters who continue demanding Mr. Lukashenko's resignation during the more than 6 weeks of mass protests. On Wednesday, protesters carrying red and white opposition flags began gathering in small groups in the capital, including outside at least 3 universities, local media footage showed. Calls circulated on social media for mass protests for the evening, according to Reuters. The Belarusian opposition movement called for an immediate civil disobedience campaign after the inauguration, according to Reuters. Pavel Lashchenko, a member of the opposition's coordination council, said on social media that he and his allies would never accept what he called Mr. Lukashenko's falsified election victory and demanded a new presidential election be held. We call on everyone to immediately start a civil disobedience campaign, Mr. Lukashenko said. The United States and the European Union have questioned the election and criticized the brutal police crackdown on peaceful protests during the first few days of demonstration. Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linas Linkevičius called Wednesday's inauguration ceremony such a farce. Forged elections, forged inauguration. The former president of Belarus does not become less former. Quite the contrary. His illegitimacy is a fact with all the consequences that this entails, Mr. Linkevičius said on Twitter. German Chancellor Angela Merkel's spokesman, Stefan Seibert, called the fact that the ceremony was prepared in secrecy very telling. Even after this ceremony today, Mr. Lukashenko cannot claim democratic legitimization, which would be the condition to recognize him as the legitimate president of Belarus, Mr. Seibert said Wednesday. Protests demanding Mr. Lukashenko to step down have rocked the country's daily since last month's election, with the largest rallies in Minsk attracting up to 200,000 people. During the first 3 days of the protest, police used truncheons and rubber bullets to disperse crowds. Several protesters died, and more than 7,000 were detained. Mr. Lukashenko has so far withstood the protests with backing from his ally, President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Despite its relatively small population, Belarus matters to Russia as a buffer state against NATO and a conduit for Russian exports of oil and gas. At a summit last week, Mr. Putin granted Mr. Lukashenko a $1.5 billion loan, and the two countries are holding Slavic Brotherhood defense exercises in Belarus. As part of those drills, Russian paratroopers parachuted into Belarus on Wednesday, according to Reuters. The time and location of the inauguration ceremony were not publicized in advance. Law enforcement officers blocked off central areas of Minsk on Wednesday morning, and public transportation services were suspended. The Vyazna human rights group said several protesters were detained near the Palace of Independence, where the ceremony took place, holding banners saying, "The king has no clothes," and "The victory will belong to the people." Alexander Klaskowski, an independent Minsk-based analyst, said the secrecy surrounding the president's inauguration illustrated the threat the ongoing unrest poses to Mr. Lukashenko's grip on power. The secret inauguration illustrates the level of trust of the leader in the official results of the election of the people. Those who officially got 80% of the vote don't act like that, Mr. Klaskowski said. Lukashenko received rebelling people as a gift from who he needs to hide during the inauguration, fearing mass protests, he said. Mr. Lukashenko has bristled at suggestions of dialogue with the opposition. Amid international outrage, Belarusian authorities switched to prosecuting top activists and mass detentions, avoiding large-scale violence. Many members of the Coordination Council that was formed by the opposition to push for a transition of power have been arrested or forced to leave the country. A prominent Coordination Council member, Paul Latushko, compared the inauguration to a gathering of thieves and refused to recognize Mr. Lukashenko as the president of Belarus. Get the Monitor stories you care about delivered to your inbox. For us, the citizens of Belarus, for the international community, he is a nobody, an unfortunate error of history and a disgrace of the civilized world, Mr. Latushko said on the messaging app Telegram. We will never agree with the falsification of the election and are demanding a new vote. We urge everyone to engage in indefinite civil disobedience. This story was reported by the Associated Press, Reuters writer Andrei Mahovsky, and AP writer Daria Litvinova in Moscow. Luidas Dabkus in Vilnius, Lithuania, and Geir Molson in Berlin contributed to this report. Up next, replacing RBG in looming Senate battle. Both sides race to the brink, by Peter Greer. The battle to fill Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat on the U.S. Supreme Court is shaping up to be a defining moment in politics, a titanic struggle that could shift a presidential election and produce enormous policy consequences while straining the limits of American constitutional democracy. Much depends on how the Senate's advice and consent confirmation process plays out. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, by vowing to proceed only weeks before Election Day, has enraged many Democrats who see the move as blatantly hypocritical given that Senator McConnell refused to even allow a hearing for President Barack Obama's nominee to an open high court seat in 2016. In response, some Democratic lawmakers are threatening, should their party win control of the Senate and the White House, to add seats to the Supreme Court to push for statehood for Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., to dilute the Republicans' geographic edge on the Senate. All these moves, Senator McConnell's included, are within constitutional bounds. The problem is the escalating brinkmanship of action and reaction. When parties exercise their power of office to the very edge, they encourage opponents to do the same if they're elected. And as the stakes of losing rise, politics become more heated, voters become more polarized, and the long-standing norm that lawmakers act with the realization they will not always be the majority withers away. What's gone on over the last 4 years is one threat after another, and the weakening of our institutions. Our institutions of government are frayed at this point, says Christine Nemechek, a professor of government at the College of William and Mary. It's got to be, at some point here, country over party. An oil giant's epiphany on climate change. BP slows shift to clean energy since Deepwater Horizon spill is picking up speed, perhaps setting an example for the petroleum industry. One of the pandemic's economic effects has been a drop in demand for oil. Yet once the global economy recovers, will oil demand go back up? Some experts say no, given other ongoing shifts away from fossil fuels. Humanity may finally be reaching peak oil consumption a century and a half after the first oil well was drilled. Oil and gas will still play a big role for decades. Fossil fuel, including coal, currently are about 85% of the world's energy supply. But as more consumers, businesses, and governments tackle climate change, alternative sources, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, will continue to gain ground. One bright spot in this energy transformation is BP, the world's sixth largest petroleum company. Over the past decade, ever since its Deepwater Horizon rig gushed oil into the Gulf of Mexico, BP has had a slow epiphany about the commercial wisdom of relying on carbon fuels. Once known as British Petroleum, it now seems ready to become the Beyond Petroleum company. In August, Chief Executive Bernard Looney said BP aims to boost its spending on low-carbon projects from $500 million a year to $5 billion a year within a decade. We're transforming BP into a very different kind of company, Mr. Looney said. Not overnight, but quickly. According to Dev Sanyals, BP's Executive Vice President of Gas and Low Carbon Energy, in the next 5 years, BP will initiate more than 20 gigawatts of renewable energy projects from about 2.5 gigawatts today. The company will also stop looking for new oil and gas sources and would cut its oil and gas output by 40%. Instead, it will invest in giant offshore wind as well as solar projects, perhaps reimagining its thousands of BP gas stations as convenience stores with recharging stations for electric vehicles. It aims to be a carbon neutral company by mid-century. The plan is to keep profits from fossil fuels flowing long enough to transition BP to something more like an electric utility that could offer investors solid, though not spectacular, dividends in the 8 to 10% range. The alternative, Mr. Looney said, was to not act and wait to get regulated out of business by measures aimed at halting climate change. The latest edition of the company's respected World Energy Outlook lays out 3 scenarios for the oil market. One shows rapid moves to protect the environment and climate, resulting in a dramatic drop in oil consumption. A second is less aggressive, but still results in much lower oil use. And even its business as usual shows consumption staying at current levels and then drifting gradually downward. Other oil giants have faced the same dilemma as BP, change or become less and less relevant. ExxonMobil recently lost its place as one of the 30 benchmark stocks making up the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Ramping up clean energy might need companies capable of building giant infrastructure and yet nimble and enlightened enough to transform themselves. BP is showing a new course in a world weaning itself off of energy sources that pollute. Well, our last item is Points of Progress by Lindsay McGinnis. In the Philippines is launching a new mobile app to combat wildlife trafficking, an illegal trade estimated at $1 billion a year that threatens the country's biodiversity. Currently, Filipinos can report suspected wildlife trafficking incidences through a Department of Environment and Natural Resource hotline, but a lack of cell phone reception or species knowledge can pose barriers to reporting. The Wild Alert app is designed to empower anyone in any part of the country to fight the illegal wildlife trade. Its offline mode helps overcome patchy internet reception by automatically recording the time and location of an incident and sending that data to the nearest DENR office once the user has a signal. The georeference feature and centralized data collection system will also help law enforcement monitor the trafficking crisis in real time. As wildlife enforcement officers and the public wait for WildAlert's full rollout, they can access the app's wildlife library of 480 species, including conservation status and common names in local dialects, on the website wildalert.ph. Well, my friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, September the 25th. I apologize for the mispronunciation of names and for the vibration of my phone going off. This is Pam saying, please stay safe till we meet again. You be blessed abundantly today and do something today to make it a great day.